Weekend. Hi, everyone. My name is Ala. This is Objection, Your Honor, RC. The concept behind this class is that I want you guys to see RC in sort of two big steps. When you're taking on an RC passage, your first and your fundamental job on RC is to understand what the passage is saying, because the passage is your client. You are being asked to break down the passage, understand what your client is telling you when they walk into your office and to say like, hey, I got involved in this incident and I'm being sued. All right. When that happens, you have to be able to figure out what your client did or did not do, what your client is or isn't liable for, how to make those, like, right. All the work of a lawyer is to understand. Now, it's a little bit simpler than what a lawyer has to do with the job that you guys have, right? All that you're being asked to do is, can you understand what the passage is talking about? Can you figure out what the author cares about? What do they want you to walk away with? Right? Think about, I don't know, those people that hang out on like sidewalks and streets and they want you to like sign a petition, right? They care about you signing the petition. It's exactly like that. When the passage is written, they want you to learn something. They want you to believe something. They want you to walk away with something. Your job is to figure out what that is. What do they care about? What does your client care about? That's the first half of the battle with RC. It's the most fundamental part, but your job isn't quite over yet. Because when you shift over, and I do mean it as a shift, when you pull out of the passage and you go into the questions, you are now in a different arena. You're in a different battle. Because the battle is no longer, can I understand what the client is telling me? It's, can I protect my client from accusations? Can I protect my client from shit that opposing counsel is saying that they said, which they did not say? And opposing counsel in this case is speaking through the 4 wrong answer choices in every question. Right? Like you could get through RC without ever actually being sure of the right answer, like you could get through most of the LSAT or all the LSAT without ever knowing what the right answer is, just by eliminating the wrong 4 ones. The reason, though, that I emphasize that you have to be able to literally stand up and go, objection, Your Honor, my client didn't say that, is because that protective instinct that you have for the passage is going to help you through most of the problems that students commonly face in private tutoring and in my classes that I've noticed. The most common mistakes that students make is they take it on as they try to go find their answer, which is not a bad instinct. That's what prediction is, right? They try to go find their answer, but in trying to find their answer, they forget what their client said. They forget what they're loyal to in the passage. So I'm happy to talk more about like exactly why it's so helpful to think about it in this 2-step process, right? 1 is to understand your client, and 2 is to protect your understanding of the passage against wrong answer choices. But the best way to do this is to go through a passage together. So that's what we're going to do. And for those of you that haven't been in my classes before, welcome. It's wonderful to see you. It's really nice to meet you. We are going to do the passage in an interactive style, which means that I'm going to read a sentence or a phrase to you, and one of you, a very lucky and awesome volunteer, or a couple of volunteers more likely, will be like, I think this is what it means. I think this is maybe some of the context the author is providing. I think this might be actually part of the author's main point. It seems like they seem like pretty opinionated about this. So that's how we're going to take this on. So let me know if you have any questions about that. So let me pull up the passage for today. Ooh, we got a long one here. Oh, we got a bit of a, did we do this one recently? No, we didn't. Wait a second. Sorry, I'm just making sure that you, okay, no, we haven't done this one recently. All right. So we have 1, 2, 3, we have 4 paragraphs. We're going to do 4 volunteers. Actually, I'm thinking about this. Yeah, no, we're going to do 4 volunteers. So who wants to volunteer for the first paragraph? Dahlia, awesome. Is it Dahlia or?
Yes.
Is that saying it right?
Yes, it's Dahlia.
Dahlia, awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, Dahlia. And then if other people want to volunteer, think about it. Give me 1 second. I'm gonna do some fiddling here. Okay, but you got the exercise, right? You ready?
Yeah, do you want me to read?
Yeah, so I'll read to you. You just want to have a conversation with me about what's going on.
Okay, sure.
Does that track?
Yeah, sure.
Awesome. Recently, the focus of historical studies of different ethnic groups in the United States has shifted from the transformation of ethnic identity to its preservation.
Okay, so
What's going on there?
usually whenever I have an RC passage, I like zoom into the first sentence. I feel you can
Good.
always find something going on there,
Yeah.
usually very important. So recently, I guess it puts us in the background
Mm-hmm.
going on, and we're focusing on ethnic groups and its transformation from one thing to another thing.
Yeah. What are the things?
From ethnic identity to preserving the ethnic identity.
Yeah. What might that look like outside the context of like, specifically this? What might it look like to go from transforming an ethnic identity to preserving the ethnic identity?
Yeah, yeah. Well, this is something I can identify with coming from a minority family or a minority group.
Yeah.
So preserving my ethnicity, I guess,
Mm-hmm.
um, our culture,
Yeah.
tradition, so on. So instead of saying like America is a melting pot, it's more like a mixing salad where everyone
Mm-hmm.
has its own
Yeah.
distinct
Yeah.
flavor.
I love that. I recently was thinking about that. Somebody told me like it's not a melting pot, it's
Yeah.
more of a fruit salad, right? Like
Mhm.
where
Ev-
each component is allowed to remain its own. Yeah, exactly.
yeah.
So awesome. And for anyone wondering, like, am I allowed to bring my personal experiences in? Yes, please do that. Because if you can put things into your own context, it means you're understanding what's going on.
Mhm.
Fantastic, Dahlia. All right. Whereas earlier historians argued that the ethnic identity of various immigrant groups to the United States blended to form an American national character. Let's stop there. That's a long sentence.
Yes. So right away, right off the bat, the word whereas
Mm-hmm.
is a pivot word. So maybe this is the author's voice or opinion coming in. I always like focus on pivot words when I see them.
Sure.
So I know that we had an idea. Um, hmm. Yeah, so here, well, maybe it's not a pivot word yet, but yeah, so we're talking about the way it used to be.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so earlier historians thought that they had to blend in.
Mm-hmm.
Now, maybe now we have a different focus or a different explanation.
Yeah. So you're not wrong about the pivot word, right? You're not wrong about whereas, right? Whereas earlier historians thought this, but the reason why you might be having a little bit of trouble with the Dahlia is because whereas is about that whole first clause,
Mhm.
right? Whereas earlier historians argued that it was like a blended thing,
Mhm.
the new scholarship has focused on the transplantation of ethnic cultures to the United States.
Okay, so we had one, maybe old versus new or
Mm-hmm.
something, the way it used to be now, the way it is now. So it used to be transforming the ethnic identity. Now it's we're trying to save it and take care of it or preserve it.
Yeah, exactly. So I think Rich was talking about, here's who we are to who we've been historically. I think that that's a helpful perspective to have. And Saharla, if you're asking if it might be a concession word, I think that might be a slight step too far. I think one of the difficult things about difficult passages, which this one probably will be, given it's a passage four, the main thing to keep in mind is that you have to take baby steps, right? You can't assume anything. You can't go further than the passage is going to allow you to go forward. So I don't know that whereas is a concession, but whereas is just saying like earlier it was like this and the new scholarship has focused on this. Does that mean that there has never been scholarship about the transplantation of ethnic cultures? No, it's just saying like generally the old stuff is that way and the new stuff is this way. But And that's just me giving an example to make the point that you want to be reserved as you understand the passage, right? Be clear and be confident about what you do know, but be really careful and weary of what you don't know. Wary of what you don't know. Okay, great. Fujita and O'Brien's Japanese American ethnicity provides an example of this recent trend. Ooh, so what recent trend are we talking about, Dahlia?
Oh, yeah, the preservation of the ethnicity or yeah.
Yes, I think that's a piece of it, but we're also going from that, like earlier historians argued, right? Oh, well, they're both about the same thing. So I think you're right. It's about the preservation. Yes.
So I think here the author is giving us examples of this recent trend, like of writers who address this maybe.
Yeah. And I mean, it goes on saying it also exemplifies a problem that is common to such scholarship.
Yes. Yeah, so I think the author here is trying to back up his idea that we have a shift in the way things were looked at, and he's using examples, or he or she, they're using an example of Fujita and O'Brien,
Mhm.
I guess.
And that's an example of the which it is. Which is it an example of? Are we talking about the shift in the first sentence, or are we talking about the new scholarships, or are they both the same thing?
I think here, provides an example of this.
And these are all questions open to the class. So if you want to participate in the chat, go for it.
I think he's talking about the new scholarship.
Okay.
So
I think you're right, but I think it might be both.
it might be both.
I
Okay.
think it might be both. Alex, is that what you wanted to say?
Oh, not that it was both. I wanted the clarity because, and I keep using this phrase, but two fences, two sides of the fence, one fence being the shift identity preservation. Second, the other side of the fence is the new scholarship and introducing that idea. But
You're seeing the transformation of, or sorry, the shift differently from the new scholarship?
yeah, the shift initially was an ethnic identity to preservation, whereas new scholarship is a transplantation of what was brought to the United States. Maybe
And I think this is where we might want to give this an extra glance here, because here they're not just talking, because you're correct, Alex, you're thinking about this the right way, but I think there's another layer to this. So we're not just talking about shifting from the transformation of ethnic identity to its preservation, but under preservation, we are including the new scholarship that focuses on transplantation.
Okay.
I think that we're talking about both. Salma, new scholarship is focused on the transplantation. Yeah, it's preservation and transplantation. If I was trying to be a good student here, I wouldn't assume, right? We're not necessarily assuming that they're both the same thing, but they both seem to be talking about the same thing. So we're going to look for more confirmation. Here's the thing about RC, y'all. If you're ever worried that you're making an assumption, just hold on to the assumption, don't make it yet, and wait until they give you confirmation, because they'll do that. But I also want to make it clear that asking these questions is always a good thing, right? Asking what they mean when it says of this recent trend. I think they're mostly talking about the new scholarship, but it probably also has something to do with the first sentence about the transformation of ethnic identity to the preservation of ethnic identity. Are we following that? Is that too messy to keep track of? You following that?
I follow it now. I just can't grab onto it initially. I just, because you answered it, makes sense, basically.
Yeah, no, that's okay. That's okay, Alex. I think the point I'm trying to make is that I always ask myself these questions in the first paragraph when these ideas come up, because it allows me to know, okay, like what do I definitely know and what do I definitely like I'm unsure about. When I ask those questions, I give myself an opportunity to go, okay, I'm curious about that. Let's get some more explanation later.
Well, so the way I'm looking at this is that we have an example of the recent trend of trying to preserve an identity, but also like the author is saying, it also exemplifies a problem that's common. So we're going to address maybe a problem with that
Mhm.
new way of thinking of ethnic identity, I guess. So,
Yep.
that's sort of, so I'm thinking that we're talking about the recent trend, and what I'm predicting, or I'm thinking that the next paragraphs, I haven't read this paragraph yet, the whole thing, but
Yeah.
I'm thinking that we're going to look at this recent trend, and then we're going to look at maybe problems that come with it. I don't know.
So, are we talking about the problem? Is the it in the last clause? And again, this is a question for everybody as well. Is the it in the last clause talking about the trend, or is it talking about Japanese American ethnicity, the book itself?
Oh,
think
no,
it's the book.
the book itself.
Yeah, the book itself. Okay, great. Dahlia, I think you did a fantastic job
Thank
reading.
you.
Thank you for volunteering.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Salma, you ready?
Yes.
In comparing the first three generation of Japanese Americans, and then these are the names, Fujita and O'Brien conclude that assimilation to the United States culture increased among Japanese Americans over three generations, but that a sense of ethnic community endured.
Yeah, so the first three generations kind of blended really well into American culture, or I mean assimilated in the way I know it usually has a negative connotation. And I don't really know how you feel about like adding connotations because I've kind of fallen into trap before, but anyway, I think it's generally probably negative here in terms of the sense that they were kind of like invisible among for those generations, but even though that was true, they still had a sense of ethnic community.
Yeah, so I think I'm okay with you going as far as saying assimilation might be negative,
Mm-hmm.
but I think we want to be careful about saying if assimilation, like is like, forcing them to be part of the community, or what was the second term you used?
I said invisible.
Invisible. I think invisible might be going too far because assimilation, what do you think assimilation means? Like on its own. I get that you think it's negative, but what comes to mind when I say assimilation?
Adopt principles and
Love
just
that.
yeah, adopt
Great.
of a nation or of a different people.
Yeah, I think you're right, right? Adoption, Akshat is saying blending, right? So we are talking about that kind of notion. And I think you're referencing the first paragraph where they said like it's not about being blended to form a national character, but it's about how they brought their own cultures, right? The transplantation.
Mm.
So in this sentence though, we're talking about how assimilation included, but look at the second rest of it, the last clause of the sentence, Salma, it says, but that a sense of ethnic community endured.
Right.
So here it might be that assimilation is not necessarily negative. We're talking about adapting, right? We're talking about being, about joining this majority culture, but we're not losing, right? We're not becoming negative, or sorry, we're not becoming invisible in the process of doing that. Does that make
Right. Yeah, I agree with whoever said that it's like blended. It ties back. I usually struggle with tying stuff back to like the main point or like our main understanding. So how that word assimilation fits into our main understanding right now, I think is the word blended in the first paragraph. Because it says they blended to form but it had the new scholarship was focused on the transplantation of ethnic cultures. So they were blended / assimilated, but they still had a sense of ethnic community. I don't know if that's just jumping to conclusions.
So blended, I want to be careful that as we're talking about all these terms, blended was the one that the earlier historians used.
Right.
Here, assimilation, I can see why it would be blended. I think you guys are correct about that. But we are still talking about the new scholarship, right? We're talking about,
Right.
yeah, there's some blending in new scholarship, but We're
Mm.
talking about how the sense of ethnic community still remained.
Okay.
And we see how that's new, right, Salma? Like that's
Yeah.
a new idea. Okay, awesome. Although the persistence of community, I'm sorry, Rich, you had a question. You good?
I was just gonna say, it to me, this is kind of reinforcing that thought of this preservation. Like, so there's this sort of new training or transition trend, but there's still this thread of identity that is being included. So it's not replacement, it's kind of transformation, but there's still a retention of this identity. So to me, it's further support for that earlier thought in the first paragraph.
Okay, I can see that.
All
right, thank you. Although the persistence of community is stressed by the authors, okay, their emphasis in the book could just as easily have been on the high degree of assimilation of the Japanese American population in the late 20th century. What is this? What is this going back to?
I mean, I obviously like literally know what they're saying. I'm trying to think about how, oh, the persistence. I mean, they're literally saying, although this is what they were talking about, their message still would have been the same if they had talked about something else. Or, but I
Yes.
don't really understand how you go back to why that would maintain structure if you go back to assimilation.
Yeah, let's take it piece by piece because there's like 2 or 3 things going on here. What do they mean when they say persistence of community? Which kind of community are they talking about?
The Japanese community.
Yeah, the Japanese community, but like what they talk about it just in the previous sentence.
The ethnic community endured that part of it. Yeah.
Right, exactly. So it's although the persistence of the ethnic community endured. So, and what point is that? That's a point that the book is making, right? Fujita and O'Brien conclude that the sense of ethnic community endured.
Oh, right.
Right. So there now we're almost like removing ourselves 1 degree of separation from the book itself. Now we're talking about, although the persistence of the community is stressed by the authors, right? The sense of ethnic community is stressed by the authors, their emphasis. So the author's emphasis in the book could just as easily have been on the assimilation part. What does that mean?
I'm not quite sure how it fits into everything else we've been reading.
Take a look at the last clause of the first paragraph.
It also yeah.
Right. And is being able to equally able to talk about the ethnic sense of, ethnic community enduring and the assimilation kind of an issue for the scholarship?
Yeah, totally. That
right.
means
It's almost like
it wasn't strong enough. It could, yeah.
Right. It's like the blue, like it's like the picture with the dress. It's like, did you see a blue dress or did you see a white dress? Like where are we going with this? Because if you could have seen the blue dress and you could have seen the white dress, then we're all screwed.
Right. Totally.
Do we guys follow that point? And now that you know that, Salma, what do you think we're starting to get a hint of in this paragraph? Like what the author seems to maybe care about?
Well, they definitely care about the narrative that the book is putting out and saying maybe that it's not strong enough if it can support opposing points, kind of.
Right. And what is this a book? Is this book like the thing the author cares more about, or is this book an example of something the author cares about?
It's an example.
It's an example. So they're trying to demonstrate, it seems like a larger point about this kind of scholarship. And they're like, look, if you take this book, a book that seems very, very much intertwined with the sense of ethnic community that endured, you can just make the exact same point, like points that they're making, but towards assimilation.
Right. Right.
And that sounds like a huge logical problem with what they're doing.
Got it. Mm-hmm.
In addition, their data reveal that the character of the ethnic community itself changed. The integration of the third generation into new professional communities and non-ethnic voluntary associations. Let's stop there. That's a long sentence.
In addition, their data reveal. Is this exemplifying a assimilation in a way?
I think you're exactly correct, right?
Okay.
Because does this sound like good news for
No.
the new scholarship or bad news for the new scholarship?
Bad news.
It's bad news, right? If their data is showing that like they are integrating, right? And they're
Right.
integrating the third generation into professional communities and into non-ethnic voluntary associations. I'm thinking like, you know, like a community garden or something like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And at the very least, that ethnic ties had to accommodate multiple layered identities.
And none of the military. And at the very least, the ethnic ties. Yeah, like again, the assimilation aspects. It's not really highlighting theirs necessarily, but it's multipled and layered.
Yep. And again, that sounds a lot more like assimilation to me than,
Right.
than we're talking about retaining a culture like as it is.
Right.
Okay. Fujita and O'Brien themselves acknowledge that there has been a weakening of Japanese American ethnic community life. Yikes.
Yeah, so they're well, I guess my just quick question is that like can't they still write a book about about the ethnic community even if it's weakening? But I know it goes against their whole like idea of like stepping away from the assimilation part. But
Well,
does
I
it
think
say
that's a fantastic question.
mm-hmm.
That's a fantastic question. Can they still talk about how they're retaining their identity culture if there has been a weakening? Maybe you can. It sounds like it's possible.
Mm-hmm.
But the author though is taking issue with how like fam, you're literally admitting to me that there's been a weakening. How are you not seeing that this is also an assimilation thing?
Right, exactly.
Right, exactly. And I think Rich's point is also correct. Okay, awesome. All right, we'll keep going. Do folks want to hear Charles? You want to volunteer, or you have a question?
No, I was going to volunteer. Yeah,
Yeah, awesome. All right, how are you doing?
I'm doing good.
All right, ready?
Yeah, sure.
Because of the social changes weakening the bonds of community, Fujita and O'Brien maintain that the community cohesion of Japanese Americans is notable not for its initial intensity, but because there remains a degree of involvement in the ethnic. Oh my gosh, it just goes on. Let's stop at because. So we're talking about social changes weakening. Fujita and O'Brien maintain that the community cohesion is not notable for its initial intensity.
Yeah. So when I read this, it seems to me that like Fujita and O'Brien sort of like recognize sort of like some of the things that was mentioned in the last paragraph. Sort of is trying to downplay. I mean, I don't know what it says next, but it's saying that it's not notable for its initial intensity, but it's for some other thing that we haven't even got to yet. I haven't read the next thing yet.
Yeah, no, that's good. But noting it, especially for these long sentences, Charles, is really important to stop and go like, okay, what the hell did you say so far? Let me make sure I track that before I add something on. But question for you, initial intensity, are we thinking that's in the assimilation bucket or is that in retaining the identity culture bucket?
That's in that's in the assimilation.
Well, if your ethnic culture is initially super, well, hang on.
Because it's talking about the weakening of bonds, and I thought the initial intensity was talking in reference to the weakening of the bonds.
Yeah, but I also, yeah, no, I think you're right. So the weakening of the bond, so it's not about its initial intensity, but because there remains a degree of involvement in the ethnic community surpassing that found in most other ethnic groups at similar points in their ethnic group life cycle.
Give me a second, I've got to reread.
Oh yeah, no, go for it.
So what? They're saying that like Japanese Americans, even as the assimilation goes, there's still a certain degree of involvement in the ethnic community that's surpassing some other groups. Yeah.
Essentially, right? They're almost saying like, hey, if Japanese Americans are, I don't know, they're maintaining their community cohesion at 40%, and I don't know, the Indian American community is maintaining it at 30%, and like they find an average among other communities, then they're saying that the Japanese Americans were able to retain their community cohesion better than the average other ethnic group.
Yeah. Okay. So they're just so it's like okay. So Fujita and O'Brien, they sort of like recognize the thing that's stated in the last paragraph, but they're saying, okay, well, while this is true, there is a weakening. There's still Japanese Americans in our book. They're still relatively better off than at least in the cohesion side of things than other
Yeah.
groups.
Yep,
Okay.
exactly. This comparative difference is important to Fujita and O'Brien, and they hypothesize that the Japanese American community persisted in the face of assimilation because of a particularly strong pre-existing sense of peoplehood.
Interesting. Okay, so they're saying that comparatively, the reasons why Japanese Americans were able to have a relatively higher sense of involvement of ethnic communities because they have some stronger pre-existing sense of like peoplehood. I don't know what peoplehood means in this case, but they have it comparatively more than other people do.
Yeah.
And so
And
that's
it's okay if you don't know what peoplehood means, but like best guess, Charles, what do you think it means? Like what kind of thing? Are we thinking is a good thing, a bad thing? Like any thoughts about peoplehood?
I think it's I mean it's a good thing in
Mhm.
there. I think it's just ultimately just if I were to put it in my own words, just sort of like I don't know, this is weird, like ethnic loyalty. I don't know how else to put it. Yeah,
Maybe,
something like that. Yeah, I don't
right?
know.
Some kind of like something that like groups you with the other people in your community, something about that.
You're right.
They argue that this sense of peoplehood extended beyond local and family ties.
Okay. So it extends beyond local and family ties. The first thing that came to my mind is like, okay, so what does that mean? Like, what do we mean when if it goes beyond local and family ties? So that's something I'm like hoping that the next paragraph gets to.
Mhm.
But yeah, okay, that's like an interesting point. Okay, they
What might be an example of going beyond, like as for a Japanese American community, what might be going beyond local and family ties? Like what could that look like?
local and family ties towards. I don't know. I feel like local is pretty broad. I'm not sure if I'm because I was
Right.
gonna
So
say I
as
was
an
gonna
example, I mean, like I'll talk about myself. Like for instance, I get really happy when I see like interracial couples out in the wild. It makes me very happy because I'm part of an interracial couple, and that has nothing to do with me being local. I'm like if I see them when I'm at an airport, it's not me being local. They're not my family, but I get happy about it because it's a part of a community that I belong to. Even though there's not like an association of interracial couples that I'm like the president of or something. That's not what it is, right? I think they're talking about what sense of community there is in a group that doesn't connect to local and family ties.
right.
Could be similar to that. All right, awesome. I'm going to finish up this last paragraph by myself if that sounds good to you guys. You guys can hear me finish out also because I want to make sure we have time to do the questions and talk about them. Awesome. Charles, you did a great job. And I don't know if I said that, but Who was the second person to read? Selma, you did a great job too. Fujita and O'Brien's hypothesis illustrates a common problem. Okay, we're circling back to the problem, right? The one that we brought up in the first paragraph. In studies that investigate the history of ethnic community. All right, so sounds like a signpost, a little label for what the author really does care about. Maybe we're going to get some more analysis here, right? We already know that the whole book could have been written like under assimilation. We also know that like there was a lot of assimilation in the same like analysis that Fujita and O'Brien were doing. We know that their data was showing that. We also know that like they were making some arguments about like, hey, we're not even talking about local and family. We're talking about like how Japanese Americans were special among other immigrant groups. And we know that they had that like peoplehood sense, right? They were part of a community, and that was not about being local, not about being in a family. Like historians who have studied European ethnic cultures in the United States. Okay, I'm thinking about like, I think Rich mentioned like Irish immigrants, right? Fujita and O'Brien have explained persistence of ethnic community by citing a pre-existing sense of national consciousness that is independent of how a group adapts to United States culture. Okay, this is sounding a little bit like, you know, as it says, it's Fujita and O'Brien's hypothesis, right? They're talking about like, hey, we're not talking about assimilation. We're talking about how the Japanese Americans had a distinct and very strong sense of being Japanese while they were in America and while they were Japanese Americans that just kind of held them together differently. I'm still looking for the author's like slam dunk type of response, right? Like, why does the author seem to think that this is such a categorically like stupid or bad kind of scholarship? However, okay, we got a little signpost for you, Dahlia, right? However, let's hear more. It's difficult to prove, as Fujita and O'Brien have attempted to do. Notice, attempted, they're not successful, they're just attempting, that a sense of peoplehood is a distinct phenomenon. Distinct is doing a lot of heavy lifting there, right? What does it mean to say that something is a distinct phenomenon? I think we're talking about it being special, right? It being maybe unique even. So, well, maybe Japanese Americans have this, but maybe so do a bunch of other cultures. Historians should instead, should is a big, big word, right? Should makes it a normative claim. It's now like, this is how I think the world ought to be, how it should be. Should instead attempt to identify directly the factors that sustain community cohesion in generations. Okay, so identify directly, that's a lot of qualifiers, right? We're talking about should identify directly. So we're not talking about like something nebulous or kind of like in the air or cloudy. We're talking about direct factors that sustain, right? That maintain community cohesion in generations that have adapted to United States culture and have been exposed to the I can never say the word, pluralism, I don't know, of American life. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about how the historians, they need better proof, right? They can't just be like, hey, like there's some aspects of peoplehood. Just having peoplehood isn't enough, right? Like the Indian American community that I belong to has peoplehood to it, right? Like so many different groups in the United States have peoplehood, but hey, it's not, you're not special just because you have peoplehood. You have to identify, you have to be able to identify these direct factors, right? These clear cut factors, if you want to be able to say that like Japanese American community is in some way special. We following that? Did that track? Yeah? Okay. I'm going to send you guys off to do the questions. There are 8 of them, and they look like they will take you guys a bit of time. I'm going to give you about 12 minutes to work out those questions, and I'm going to publish a poll for which ones we want to talk about. All right, good luck. Remember that you did the work to understand the passage. take another 30 seconds to a minute to wrap up. Please fill out the poll if you haven't already. So first of all, I think a couple of you did really well on this. So pat on your back for that. That's awesome. This is a really tough passage. So if you did good, I think that means good things. So let's look at what we've got here. Looks like the main questions are towards the end. So we'll do 23, 24, 25, and then after those three, it's a free for all basically until we have time. We can talk about any of the ones that you guys want to. Does that sound good? Awesome. All right, number 23. In the first sentence of the third paragraph, the author quotes Fujita and O'Brien most probably in order to. So when it's one of these like quote question, basically like where they highlight a part of the passage for you, the best way to tackle that is to look at the sentence before, look at the sentence that has the quote in it, and look at the sentence after, because context is everything. And the answer, like 99% of the time, is either in the sentence before the sentence or right after the sentence. Okay. And when I do this sort of like rereading, I'm skimming because I already did the thorough work of reading, right? I'm not going to force myself to like re-understand everything. Okay. So we were talking about Fujita and O'Brien, and the sentence before was essentially just like the end, and they were talking about how there's a lot of talk of assimilation in the book. And because social changes that weaken the bonds of community, they're saying like Japanese Americans, the cohesion of Japanese Americans isn't a big deal because of its initial intensity, but it's a big deal because compared to other groups, it was doing really well. And then the difference is super important to them because they think that like they had this like peoplehood aspect. Right? That's the recap there. So why did they quote that? Well, they quoted that because they wanted to compare they wanted to find the actual part of Fujita and O'Brien's argument, right? It wasn't just because they were initially really intense as a community, but it was because of this peoplehood aspect. So did they bring it up, right? Did they quote the book to point out a weakness in their hypothesis? I'm already kind of really suspicious about this, right? Were they pointing out a weakness in this? Remember, it's not asking you if there was a weakness associated with this quote in general. It's asking you, why'd they bring this quote up, like in this part of the argument specifically? I think they brought this up to compare and show you like it's not the initial intensity, it's something else, it's the peoplehood. And then they tell you that peoplehood is not distinct. But that point has nothing to do with the quote that they're making here. So that's what makes A wrong. B, show how they support their claim about the notability of community cohesion for Japanese Americans. I think so, but it's a little vague for me. I don't love B because I wish it would be a little bit more specific, but I think that's right. They're quote it in order to show you how Fujita and O'Brien support their claim about why Japanese American communities are special. Do we see that for B? Okay. C, indicate how they demonstrate the high degree of adaptation of Japanese Americans to the United States culture. Remember, they weren't They weren't on board with assimilation, or they didn't think it was that good of a thing. So it's not C. Did the author bring up that quote to suggest that there have been that they have inaccurately compared? I'm sorry, guys. I feel like I'm speaking a lot of words wrong. Suggest that they have inaccurately compared Japanese Americans to other ethnic groups. No, remember, it wasn't about how that comparison was inaccurate. It's just that the comparison isn't special. But again, that's a later point. That's not something they're making here. E, emphasize their contention that the Japanese American sense of peoplehood extended beyond local and family ties. I'm assuming most of you that got this wrong picked E. No? Okay. Well, let me know if you want to talk about a specific answer. Okay, that's good, Akshat. There's a reason why you did, because you're like, well, they brought up the peoplehood thing and then told you like, hey, it's not just peoplehood, right? But that's not why they brought up this specific quote. This specific quote was brought up for them to be able to show why they think, or sorry, show how Fujita and O'Brien themselves think that Japanese Americans are special. Do we see that? Do we see why it's B and not E? Akshat, did you want to add something?
Yes, it makes sense now that I reread it with you doing this question, but when I was doing originally, I picked the wrong answer.
Yeah.
Sometimes careful with reading again.
It's about being narrow about how you take on the question, right? If you're thinking about this quote in the entire, structure of the passage, you're not really wrong about the connection they're making about, right? Like about local and family ties and how that has to do with peoplehood. It's a weak connection, but there is a connection. But remember, the question's not asking you, how does this fit into their argument? It's asking you, why did the author bring up this quote in the passage? They brought it up specifically to show you this, and then they went on to make a different point about peoplehood.
Got it. Yeah.
Okay, that's good.
Okay.
Right, number 23, and then let's do number 24 and 25, and then we'll make it a broader discussion. Ooh, tone question. The passage suggests that the author would be most likely to describe the hypothesis mentioned in the first sentence of the last paragraph. So they highlight it for us. So this is Fujita and O'Brien's hypothesis. Dahlia, I'm just going to pick on you because I've been doing cold calling. Dahlia, without worrying about the answer choices, without worrying about anything else,
Yes.
the author's attitude towards Fujita and O'Brien's hypothesis, is it positive, is it negative, or is it neutral? What do we think?
No, I think it's more like it carries like a suspicion. Like I feel like the author is sort of like suspicious and like skeptical of like what these authors are trying to do. So it's more on the negative side.
I think you're right. I think it's negative. So just based off of knowing that, I can get rid of A.
Mm-hmm.
And I can probably get rid of E as well because it's neutral. Well, it's actually negative. So maybe we'll keep that one in. But I asked that question thinking there'd be more positive answers, but there aren't. But generally you can get rid of the positive answers if you're like, okay, no, I know for sure the attitude is negative. Okay, great. Thanks, Dahlia. All right, we got rid of A. B, do we think it's original but poorly developed?
No.
No, right? Because what does original mean?
Like innovative or something that no one's ever come up with.
Did we ever get any indication that they were the first ones to come up with this? Nope. Difficult to substantiate. We'll make that.
Yeah, that's the answer that I chose because I felt that the author was suspicious because he felt like they're addressing something, but they don't have enough to prove it.
Yep.
And so that's sort of where my answer came in.
Great. Illogical and uninteresting. Ugh.
No, not at all.
That's too strong, right? That's very, very critical. E, and we talked about E, but I think E is also negative, but it's saying too similar to earlier theories. Did we ever get an indication that they're like plagiarizing earlier theories? No.
No.
And E is wrong here for the same reason that B is wrong. Right? Because B is talking about like, B is dunking on it in the same, or is it B? Am I thinking about B? Yeah, I'm thinking about B. Okay. Yeah. How do we feel about this one? Is this okay? Okay. Number 25, which is the winner for today. The passage suggests which one of the following about the historians mentioned in the second sentence of the last paragraph. Okay, so I'm going to go scroll myself down to historians. So again, I'm going to read the sentence before, just look at it. So this was the one we were just reading. So the hypothesis is a common problem, right? This is the issue with the new scholarship. And like historians who have studied European ethnic cultures in the United States, so we're talking about, like, I think the example I came up with, like the Irish, right? Like the Irish communities, the Irish American communities. So the historians that have looked at people like that, it goes on to say that Fujita and O'Brien have explained the persistence by looking at a pre-existing national consciousness that's independent. But that's difficult to prove because it's not distinct. So now I've reminded myself of where we are in the argument. Essentially, we brought up the historians to be like, hey, you guys are all kind of talking about the same thing. You're saying like there's, Fujita and O'Brien are saying like, hey, Japanese Americans are special because they have distinct peoplehood, right? But what if the Irish Americans also had distinct peoplehood? Then Fujita and O'Brien would be kind of shit out of luck, right? They'd be like, oh, well, I can't make that argument because I told you that peoplehood was really distinct. So the question's asking me, what does the passage suggest about these historians? I think they are going to say something like, they're going to say something similar to what Fujita and O'Brien said, right? Because Fujita and O'Brien brought up considerations about how they were really persistent. They already had this like sense of peoplehood. But the one part that they don't have is the peoplehood is a distinct phenomenon. Okay, I think I get it. So what does it suggest about the historians? Does it suggest that the historians have been unable to provide satisfactory explanations for the persistence of European ethnic communities in the United States? I think so, right? Because if they're all talking about the national consciousness, well, you're not really proving it to me. That's what the author thinks. B, do the historians suggest that European cultural practices have survived, although the community ties to European ethnic groups have weakened? Did we ever talk about a connection back home? I don't think we did that in this passage at all. So I can't pick B. C, the historians have hypothesized that European ethnic communities are based on family ties rather than on a sense of national consciousness. What? When did we ever talk about that? And if I'm making fun of an answer choice you chose, I'm trying to embody what I want you guys to embody. I promise I'm not making fun of you. D, they've argued that European cultural traditions have been transformed in the United States because of, what's in American life. No, we barely know anything about the study of European ethnic cultures in the United States. We know very little. And D is outside the boundaries of that. E, they have claimed that the community ties of European Americans are still strong as they were when the immigrants first arrived. We don't know that. The only thing we know is that they haven't been able to provide satisfactory explanations because Fujita and O'Brien haven't been able to provide satisfactory explanations. Do we see that? Thumbs up if we're like conscious and kind of understanding what's going on. Okay. All right, good. It helps me to get a little check-in. Okay, well, 26 has a couple votes. Do we want to look at 26? Okay, let me look at 26 real quick. As their views are discussed in the passage, Fujita and O'Brien would be most likely to agree with which one of the following. Okay, we're just being asked, what would Fujita and O'Brien agree with? We know that they are not assimilationists, right? They don't think that. They think that there's a peoplehood that's making Japanese Americans special. A, would they think that the community cohesion of an ethnic group is not affected by the length of time? That's really strong. They probably would be like, hey, it's affected. It's just that they're able to retain this like specialness. B, an ethnic group in the United States can have a high degree of adaptation to the United States culture and still sustain strong community ties. I think so, right? Because we talked about how like third generation Japanese Americans, they were like part of community gardens and professional groups, but they still had this sort of internal cohesion. C, the strength of an ethnic community in the United States is primarily, dependent on the strength of local and family ties. I don't think so. I think primarily would be like the peoplehood, if anything. High levels of education and occupational mobility necessarily erode. Hang on. Does it matter what the rest of the sentence says? No, because I can't pick something that's talking about high levels of education and occupational mobility because they never told me anything about it. Doesn't matter what the rest of the answer has to say. I can't pick it. E, it has become increasingly difficult for ethnic groups to sustain any sense of ethnic identity in the pluralism of United States life. I don't know that. And I don't know that Fujita and O'Brien think that. But I do know that they think that you can have a high degree of adaptation, even if, adaptation to, like, you can still assimilate, but still have strong community ties. Okay. Generally, what questions do we have about this passage or the questions?
I have a question. Sorry.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I'll come to you, Charles, after. Yeah.
I mean, is it specific to this passage? Are we asking questions about this passage specifically right now?
Yeah.
Okay, then I'll wait.
Charles, is your question about the passage?
It was not specifically to this passage, but
It doesn't matter. Go for it.
Okay. Well, then in that case,
no, you can go first. I'll come to Selma after.
Okay.
I hope that's good. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. So I remember like right before class, I remember I was asking you about like kind of the understanding and like going into the questions and not like battling between two answer choices. And like after reading this and like going through the process, everyone like able to pretty much essentially read the text and then put it into their own words and have a better understanding of that.
Yeah.
Like going through the answer choices, like even I'm looking at like the difficulties of these answers of these questions right now, and like after we did this, I didn't find these like firstly difficult at all. I was like going straight through them because I had such a thorough understanding of what the passage was talking about. However, and that's really good. That's good. However, the
I
thing
love
that I
that.
figure
Okay.
out
However, what's up? Signpost.
how do I get that level, at least close to that level of like understanding of what I'm actually doing
Yeah.
the exam? Because I feel like for me is that when I read a passage, like I try to sort of be as critical about it as possible. So like if I read a sentence that says, "Oh, this presents a problem," I'm like, "Okay, what's the problem? Where is it? Why is the author telling me this? What does this mean?"
Great.
Things along those lines. And when I'm doing that, sometimes either I don't know, sometimes maybe depending on the topic or whatnot, I come out of it with sort of a tenuous understanding at best of like what it is that I'm supposed to be I'm telling you with understanding of what it is I'm supposed to take away from the reading. And
Yeah.
so I'm trying to figure out like how do I get this level of understanding? So like, we asked all these questions. Obviously, I can't ask all these questions and take a time to reflect on every aspect of every
Yeah.
sentence, every clause during an actual exam. But how do
Yeah.
I go about, like, what are some ways to go about this more efficiently as I'm like actually doing a timed exam, a time section?
Well, first of all, self-awareness, you get brownie points for that. Because if you're picking up on the fact that it's going better for you now and you're noticing like, hey, this feels different, that's awesome. Keep remembering that it works. When you do this, it works. All right. That's the first thing. Second thing is, when you're doing it by yourself, you're obviously like, we take the time to talk about it like out loud in class. You can have the same conversation in less than half the time, right? Like probably just because you're doing it in your head, right? You're not actually talking to anybody. You don't have to go through those steps. So that's one reason why it'll get far more efficient if you do this in your head. The second thing is, and this is the answer you're not going to like very much, which is it's going to come with practice. I was absolutely not able to do this when I started, but this is like automatic now. Like I do this in my own like readings for school now, right? For law school, like this is how I read now. Do I read every reading that way? No, but when it gets to a critical point of, yeah, absolutely. When it gets to a critical point of the case that I'm reading, I'm like, okay, let me like pause clause by clause and figure out what the hell is going on here. And I do it the same way that I would do it on an RC passage. Now over to some good news. What are some like actual things that you can do to be like, how do I get this level out of the readings that I'm doing just on my own? Take the time you need, not the time that you want. So what does that mean? When you are reading something and you're like, wait a second, that doesn't make sense. You can stop and go like, okay, I don't get that. That's really dumb. You didn't support that proposition at all. And now you're talking about it. You need to give me support, right? That's a very legitimate question for you to have. And you should hold on to it. Like, you should be like, okay, there's a gap here. You guys better fill it. I'm going to stay curious about this. That's good. Nurture those things. The way to be efficient is to not follow every, yellow brick road down the road, right? You don't have to follow every suspicion that you have. So if you're like, the context doesn't quite give me all the details I want, doesn't matter. Does the argument still make sense? Great, go forward with it. Does that make sense, Charles? Like when you're asking questions, I want you to ask questions in two ways. One, when it matters, right? And two, I want you to ask questions such that the argument makes sense. Like, what are they selling to you here? Literally, like a telemarketer on the phone, they're trying to convince you of something. You have to be like, okay, well, you said that there was a problem with this scholarship, and notice this is a difficult passage. They don't really tell you on the face what the problem is until the last paragraph again. So you, as a good reader, have to recognize that they said in the beginning, it exemplifies a problem. You have to keep asking yourself, does this have to do with the problem? Does that have to do with the problem as you go through? And then you get an answer close to the end where you're like, oh, okay, it's because peoplehood isn't special. Everybody has peoplehood.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. That makes sense. Yeah, I think it's just something I gotta like practice more. 'Cause I remember recently I was doing some just like practice, just drilling for the reading comp. But
Uh-huh.
then as I'm being more critical and asking more questions and sort of
Mhm.
just engaging with the text a little more, one, it makes it more engaging because
Mhm.
usually when I go from a reading comp section to a logical reasoning section, that's like
Mhm.
hell on earth. I just can't do that in my brain. But this definitely makes it a lot more engaging in that regard. But
Yeah.
secondly, I think it gives me better understanding because like once I engage with it a little more, I'm able to um, sort of pick up and retain what it is that the passage is telling me. Now I just got to figure out how to do that too, because I wrote down earlier when you said about the importance of the first two passages
Yeah.
and like being able to. You weren't saying. I take it as being like you weren't saying to like you got to like breeze by those super fast to get to the fourth passage.
No, no,
Just,
no.
but just like I guess for me, usually when I do a section, it takes me about like, what, like 10, 12 minutes, 13 minutes, something like that to finish
Standard.
a passage. I guess there are ways I can shrink that time down, but I guess it's really gonna come down to understanding the passage. So I'm not like forcing, but like trying to figure out between two different answer choices.
And that's a really critical distinction, Charles, because remember, this worked for you, right? You felt like the questions made sense. You weren't struggling as you were going through the questions. What I want you to do is practice this working in lower stakes, which means passage 1 and 2. I want you to practice this skill of understanding before moving on, understanding what the author cares about. When you do it in level 1 and level 2 passages, you are like flexing that muscle at basically a weight that you can handle. I don't know if you're into weightlifting at all, right? Like you want to be able to have that like optimal level of reps that you can make to actually get to failure. If you're doing too heavy of weights, you're not actually exercising, right? You're not actually giving yourself the right like optimal level of functioning where you can grow over time. What I want you to do is take the process that we did here. I want you to make sure you get everything you can possible out of it in those first 2 passages where the stakes are lower, where the passage is better written and the questions aren't as difficult. Practice it there. And then you'll suddenly find yourself going, oh my God, this 3rd passage wasn't that hard. I have 4 minutes for the 4th passage. That's what'll start happening. You'll eventually start making a little bit of room for the 4th passage, but practice this skill that you're finding is working on those easier passages first.
Thank you very much. And then, sorry, this just brings one last quick little question. If I do find myself in a situation where like, okay, no, I'm gonna speak it into existence. When I find myself in a situation where I like complete the 3rd paragraph and then or 3rd passage, and I have a little like I say, let's say 4 or 5 minutes for the 4th paragraph, 4th passage. What do I do there? Because I'm not gonna have enough time to read the question.
Yeah, it's an awkward space to be in, and you're not the first person to ask me that question. It happens all the time. It's an awkward time to be in. Keep chipping away at those easy passages. Keep your pressure on there. You will start making more room for the 4th passage. The best thing to do is to read the passage and just answer the main point question. Just read the passage and answer the first question. If you end up having like 6, 7 minutes, maybe you can read the passage. And what I used to do is just like click through and just find the shorter questions and answer those. It doesn't really matter like how you do it. There's no format for it or anything like that. Some students just go in order. I don't think it really matters. But just read the passage and answer one question.
Awesome. Thank you.
You're very welcome. I'm going to close out class, then I'm going to answer Salma's question. And then I think somebody wanted to chat with me one-on-one. So I will do that. And then I will hop out for to take a break before Plateau Pulverizer in 30 minutes. Thank you everyone for an awesome class. Thanks again to Dahlia, Salma, and to Charles. I think you read with me, Charles. I'm sorry. My brain's a blur. I have a midterm next week. So all right. Thanks, everyone. I'll stick around for just a couple of questions.